Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today is a schmooze day, and in a schmooze day, I have no idea what we're going to talk about. It was always fun to guess and maybe imagine what two of my guests might have in common. And I have a guest there, but I also have a third guest who told me what he's interested in, so that's even better. We have three gentlemen who are very interested in global affairs and peace and security and financial health of the planet and of the people on it. In someplace in New Mexico is Peter Phillips, who until a while ago was a professor of sociology at Sonoma State University in California. And here in Toronto, I have two friends who don't know each other yet, but they should because they're both retired. Well, no, one's a retired, the other one's a very active professor at York University. James Simeon is a professor of political science at York, and until recently was the head of McLaughlin College, which is one of the great colleges at York University. And also in Toronto, and also from York University, is Harry Glassby, who's a retired law professor from York University. And I heard Harry give a talk a few years ago excoriating multinational corporations. So that's my guess of what he might want to talk about. Anyway, we have some people who don't know each other yet and are going to get acquainted right now. James, I'm going to ask you to start out because I know you told me what you're working on well, I'll let you tell me what would you, of all the things you hot on your mind right now, what would you most like to talk about?
Well, I've been doing some work on issues of asylum, war and asylum specifically. And of course, what immediately comes to mind for most people would be the Russia-Ukrainian war. And I've been doing some work on how refugees are weaponized in warfare. So I'm really interested in the subject of forced displacement in the context of war, but the intentional or deliberate displacement of peoples as part of the tactics and strategies in terms of warfare, modern warfare. And I'm not alone in this, of course, but modern warfare is characteristic of a number of things, as we all know. The mass destruction and death that is caused by modern warfare and the technological advancement in terms of weapons targeting and so forth. It's also, of course, it traumatizes populations, and we see that in the situation of Ukraine today. And it massively displaces people as well. And since the second phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war has taken place, something in the order of about 15 million people in Russia have been displaced.
In Russia or Ukraine?
Or sorry, in the Ukraine, excuse me. 15 million people displaced, and that's over 7 million people that have been displaced outside the country, and some 8 million people that are displaced internally within the country. So mass force displacement is very much a feature of warfare. But I think also...
Sorry, are there other wars that have had anything like that amount of migration resulting or intended? You know, I have the idea that this is almost unique.
Well, it's certainly extraordinary. I think it's the most rapid and most extensive displacement since the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the unique aspects in terms of the situation in Ukraine today. Mm-hmm. But Syria is a good example. There's something in the order of about 6.5 million people that have been externally displaced within Syria. But of course, the Syrian civil war has been ongoing now for 11 or 12 years. Mm-hmm. So that's the dramatic difference between what's happening in Ukraine today and less than a year, what we see taking place, I guess in less than 5 months, what we see taking place is this huge displacement.
Mm-hmm.
But characteristic, I think, also warfare in this age is the atrocity crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that, I think, in staggering amounts.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the news reports that I've seen have indicated that in Ukraine itself, the prosecutor is investigating something in the order of about 21,000 alleged war crimes that have taken place. They've also proceeded in terms of prosecuting individuals. And there's one person who's been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for killing someone, a civilian. So I think, hopefully this isn't too shocking, but I think part and parcel of warfare, modern warfare, has been these serious international crimes that have taking place as well. And of course, that's a trigger in terms of mass displacement. People know that they're being deliberately targeted, that is civilian non-combatants, which is a war crime in itself. And we know that that's been taking place not only in Ukraine, but in other conflicts that are taking place around the world. So I'm really concerned about all of that.
Okay, well, look, you've given us a menu, an agenda that we can select from, and will no doubt come back to a lot of this. Is everything you've said, of course, is absolutely stupendously important. And we'll go on and introduce our other two guests. Peter Phillips, tell us what you would like to talk about today. What's on your mind?
Well, I'm interested in how in warfare profits continue to be made by major defense contractors. In fact, deliberate war, is beneficial to the wealth concentration in the world today. We had 5 years ago, there were 17 what I call giants. That these are trillion-dollar investment companies, like BlackRock at that time was $4 trillion. Today they've doubled. Now there's $31 trillion companies.
Hold on.
And doubled
31. Whoa, wait a minute. No, I can't let that go. Did you say $31 trillion?
No, there's 31 companies that have over $1 trillion in assets that they manage.
Okay.
Which in many ways it's even more concentrated today. The top 17 that we had found 5 years ago, now they had $43 trillion that they managed then. Now it's closer to 80, 90 trillion dollars, the same company. So most of them doubled. So we're seeing wealth being highly concentrated, and a major factor of that is the arms industry.
Any one company managing $80 trillion in assets?
There's 17 companies that today manage $80 trillion, and there's probably only about 200 people that make on the boards of directors that make the decisions as to where those trillions of dollars are going to be invested. So it's that investment that it drives war. It makes it happen.
Yeah,
it's driving the global warming situation in terms of investments and where they're going, and that's a continuing environmental catastrophe.
Okay, well, you certainly got an agenda there for us. Harry Glassby, with these two things preceding you, can you top that?
I certainly cannot. Both those ways of illustrating where our world is at the moment are thoroughly depressing and overwhelming. I think I'll begin by saying that I think one of the features of modern political life is a sense of impotence and being overwhelmed, and basically very much in the line of both James Simon and Peter Phillips. These are things we don't seem to be able to to face directly in any political and social way. And that is a tremendous difficulty. And for me as a lawyer, where I operate at a sort of meta level, right? We never deal with anything really fundamental. We structure it and we provide ideological background for everything, but we don't actually directly deal with the fundamental issues. So it's always very hard as a lawyer to comment on these things. Just a couple of things I'll pick up on the nature of warfare and increasing atrocities, increasing weaponization, and in particular using human beings as weapons in the refugee system. Part of my life is spent in Australia, where that has been a feature for the last 20 years without directly engaging in war. The Australians have used asylum seekers driven out of mostly of the Middle East, and they've used them as weapons for local politics, for domestic politics, to drive in. They've made up stories. They've treated the Australian people as victims of foreigners who are pushing their way into the country in what they call illegal way. And that as a way of treating human beings is so alienating and so repulsive. And that's multiplied in these huge warfare scenes like the Middle East, in Syria, or in the Ukraine. And I again, sense of futility. And from a lawyer's perspective, no way to handle that. There is no way to directly deal with that in any way that we can do. The question of concentration of capital and its enormous influence and the driving of war as part of it is part of its ceaseless ambition to accumulate more and more. The growth factor, which we can all talk very easily, and which of course it lies at the source of our environmental problems as well as warfare. I saw a note about weapons profiteers the other day. The United States administration has just managed to pass yet another appropriation bill for defense, where I think the Republicans and the Democrats united, as they always do on the issue, to actually give the Biden administration $58 billion more than it had asked for. And the purpose was just, as has just been mentioned, it was to give it to profiteers, private profiteers. It was done to give in what they call earmarking. The various members of the Senate and the House look after their constituents by taking some parts of those monies which are being funded by the taxpayer to give them to armaments manufacturers, security firms, technology firms, which all benefit from the war, which makes most talk of negotiation and negotiated settlements pretty irrelevant. These people have no interest in negotiating a settlement. They have an interest in growing, as they would say. And those are problems, again, that I, as a lawyer, don't know if I know how to handle. As a lawyer, my interest, and I'll just finish with that, my interest in recent times has been trying to work out a conceptual frame for myself as to how we have to deal with our notions of government. It seems clear to me, and the numbers that we just had before us illustrate that we have come at a time for a while capital was in some kind of symbiotic relation with the state, and we still believe that the state could direct capital what to do, to restrain it, to have a benign form of capitalism, to handle it. I think that we have to start thinking about two sets of governors. Our elected scheme and our private wealth scheme, and that there are actually two different spheres which are in both symbiotic and in contest and in contradiction with one another, and that we have to. And if we do not face that, I don't think we'll be able to tackle any of these problems. That we keep on pushing on our institutions, which we've created for our, what we call liberal democratic institutions. We're pushing on those, hoping that they will serve us to restrain the other sector, that private sector. We may be past the time where that is feasible at all.
Tell
and
me
that
now, just a sec, because you intrigue me. Two different sets of regulatory instruments, one for governance and one for the economy. Is that what you're saying?
not quite. I wouldn't have used that kind of verbiage. What I'm saying is that the private power to regulate us directly is now government-like. So at one stage, we used to say, I think in our literature, that they were that they had non-binding authority, which was very effective, that they could, by just their sheer wealth and economic heft, make us fall into line with their wishes and their desires. What I'm now saying is we may be at a point where they can actually directly regulate us because of their power of investment and their withdrawal power. In other words, that their growth has been successful in giving them power to actually dominate whatever other institutions we create to govern ourselves. Although they still seem to be relying on lobbyists and commissions and cheating and corruption and co-option, all of that is still going on. I think it's probably quite unnecessary. They could probably do it directly with their power. And that is a very frightening idea, if I'm right about that, because then we have no way of meeting our problems, because we keep on turning to government to do it for us. And I think, and this is very speculative, and I think it is one of the reasons why people have lost interest in electoral democracy, which is quite clear in most of our so-called advanced capitalist political economies. People are just not interested. In Australia, where I said I reside part of the time, voting is compulsory. If it wasn't, I don't think anyone would show up. And here, hardly anyone does now.
Well, no, wait a minute. That's a different thing from not. I would have to say I'm one of those people who have lost faith in democracy, but it doesn't mean I'm not interested. I spend night and day thinking about what we can do to fix it, and I exactly think that probably one of the main things we have to do is figure out how people rather than states can rule through something maybe like a citizens assembly kind of system, but something that will enable human beings to have an impact and not just corporations and the guys running them. I don't know, but I should be quiet and let you two guys elaborate on whether you have a meeting of minds on this, because I think Peter probably has something to say on it too.
Well, I think Harry is essentially correct in that governments today, their primary mission is to protect global capital. And that means militarily, intelligence agencies, all the powers, the legal system, even the Supreme Court, their primary agenda is to make sure that capital is protected, it's privately owned, and it continues to grow in a capacity of global, with a global emphasis. So we're seeing now at the World Economic Forum, of course, the Great Reset, which is an effort to get corporations, the big ones, to kind of politically come together and deal with some of the outrageous problems we have, global warming and that. But in a sense, it's mostly the globalization of capital. And I use that term pretty specifically in that you just have these few hundred people controlling most of the free-floating money in the world, trillions and trillions of dollars. They decide where it gets invested and how it's managed, and that is not good for humanity. And I think Harry's correct in that the governments aren't interested in changing that. And they will, they really try to get us to think along the lines of why this is happening and whether we blame Putin or the Saudis or whomever. it comes right back to the U.S. government, our global empire of power, and concentrated wealth that is protecting everywhere in the world.
I'm just wondering, it's not that I don't necessarily disagree with what both Peter and Harry are saying, but I'm wondering to what extent, at least some countries, some governments, you could classify as liberal democratic governments, that are still constrained by the rule of law. And then the majority of the world, state systems, are either authoritarian systems or outright dictatorships or totalitarian systems. And obviously the rule of law doesn't prevail in those countries. So I'm wondering to what degree there is any sort of latitude in this system where you have a small number of individuals that control the overwhelming amount of wealth in the world. And these states presumably are really falling in line and serving their interests. But I'm wondering if you could classify it further and say that at least in some countries, we have democracies of a certain type. And in others, you don't even have that semblance of rule of law systems that constrain them. And then you can have things happen like Assyria. You can have things happen like Ukraine. You can have things happen in Yemen and other places. So is it possible to distinguish along democratic lines in terms of the international system? And does it matter?
Harry, I think you're essentially correct in that the rule of law exists figuratively in the U.S. and other Western nations, but the reality is that the primary interest is to protect concentrated wealth and allow that wealth to be safe. That if there's debts, the governments help the wealthy collect those debts. There's pressure in various capacities from intelligence agencies to protect their kind of clients, whether it's Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, or the central banking. So governments will try to intercede when inflation starts to hit 9% or higher. They will try to intercede and kind of close down the economy to protect essentially the bond market, and so that is a primary interest. The concentrated wealth, of course, with inflation just means they get richer. But for most of us, if we're in a set capacity, we don't have other than maybe through your pension plan or your pension fund, any input into this global wealth concentration factors that we all have to deal with and think about on a daily basis. But we get zero coverage in corporate media in regards to that, other than the ideological statements that capitalism is the best way to do things.
Mhm.
The rule of law, the rule of law is a slippery phrase, right? And there are certain aspects of it which are standard. We should treat people equally according and under the law. That we should not pass criminal laws retroactively. That we should have a process whereby people are given a fair and equal chance to represent themselves. But it has no particular substance, and so decision makers, policy makers, politicians use it very much like you said before, James. How we use asylum seekers, how we use refugees. They use it as a weapon. So, for instance, the countries which mostly yell about the rule of law and apply it domestically fairly well, in the sense that I've just described it. I mean, Canada is a good example, the United States is a good example. If people can't come notionally raiding into your house, looking for things, trying to accuse you, and you have a right to be represented, to face your adversary, and all these things we do them mostly in our nation states, but we're also the nations which you identified. Stoke all these things like Yemen or Syria, or Afghanistan or Iraq. We're right there, doing unspeakable non-rule of law things, and for which we never account. We never make ourselves responsible. We exclude ourselves from judgment, indeed. On these things. So I think you can make the observation you do. It's quite true. I think that we have certain processes and institutions in place which guard us domestically better than systems which do not have that. We sacrifice something for that domestically. We emphasize, therefore, because rule of law has no substantial material content, that inequality is perfectly acceptable. We accept inequality. So, for instance, in my other field of interest, where I've worked for much of my life in labor relations law, and in labor relations law, we draw real distinctions. Our courts will say over and over again that the right to private property and the right to trade is universally protected, whereas the right to unionize and to collectivize is a privilege that can be taken away any moment. We have no difficulty. We have no difficulty saying that, and by the rule of law, we have no difficulty saying that when we tax people, that because we protect private property as a rule of law, which is fundamental to our rule of law, and that's why you can't get into somebody's house without a warrant, and we protect private property at any cost. So therefore, the people who are wealth owners, you can't tax them. We start off with the assumption that if you take their monies away from them to give to other people, redistribution and provision of welfare for the society as a whole, that needs justification. An elected government needs to politically justify the taking of money from wealthy people. And that, of course, makes it easy for them to indulge themselves and say, oh, look, it's too hard. We won't provide justification. We'll just pretend that if they keep the money, it'll be better for all of us because they'll create wealth. And the other thing, it encourages the wealth owner to say, well, it's a bad thing for government to take our money to give to others. So therefore, we justified in avoiding paying our taxation bills. We built that right into the system because if you want to compare that, and I'm talking about the rule of law here, the equality of treatment. If you want to compare that, look at the way we do what we do when we do redistribute wealthier people's money is to poorer people. We create welfare benefits of one kind or another, shelters for women, unemployment benefits, it doesn't matter, take your pick, pension schemes. Whenever we do that, we say, oh, well, we're giving some rich people's money to poorer people to have. Well, they have to prove that they're eligible. We submit them to humiliation. They have to beg. Whereas we beg the corporate sectors to give us their money because we justify taking some of it. So that's all built into our system. So that under the rule of law, and you can do that. Workers are always paid in arrears. Why are they paid in arrears? Because we don't trust them to work unless they stay in arrears. They have to stay in debt. That is one of the major mechanisms we use to make sure that everybody works. So we pay them in arrears. Being in arrears, of course, makes them vulnerable in bargaining, and makes them vulnerable in the job markets, and makes them and we create debt for them. That's all done under the rule of law, without any semblance of notion that these are coercive systems that we have in place, which are actually oppressive of the so-called autonomy of the individual protected by the rule of law. So it's a good thing. Yeah? One can speak about it as an ideal by which we try to live, and it's a good thing to try and live by. In practice, it may not mean much, certainly not externally when we're dealing with other nation states, and internally it's blighted by the fact we start off with all sorts of assumptions.
Okay, I do have a burning desire to speak. I have to try to be quiet, but I think when we talk about the rule of law and democracy, I think it's important to in this context, and that is, I think there is a huge difference between a democratic society such as Canada and an authoritarian regime. Let's say, well, we don't even need to name which ones we have in mind, but in terms of human rights, I think democracies, by and large, are a whole lot more pleasant places to live because they do observe it more, and all of the things that Harry has pointed out are true. But nevertheless, there's still a huge difference between a democratic society and an authoritarian one in general. But the other thing, the disappointment I have with democracy is, number one, voters turn out to be unable to make good decisions, and maybe it's they're too busy, too short of time, the life is too complicated, or for whatever reason, voters right nowadays are making the most idiotic decisions in a democratic society. They pick people who don't believe that viruses are important, or that climate change makes any difference, or etc. And they pick people who will, like Putin, go to war against their neighbors. Now, there's another place where I think there's a failure in democracy, and that is when it comes to international law. International law is totally unenforceable. So we have all these laws that officially say, the World Court, in fact, the ICJ has definitely said, Russia, get out of Ukraine. You have no business being there. Stop it right now and go home. And of course, they may as well have stayed in bed that day because it has no impact whatever. And there's no way of prosecuting somebody who's literally a war criminal, such as Putin, who is actually committing genocide or war crimes against people. So I think that the failure at the international level to have anything like a world government or any input, and if we had a world government, it would be the UN, where the nation states are running things for their own benefit, or maybe just for the benefit of the bond market, if Peter would have it. So, I don't know how to fix the thing, but I do think that we need to put people back in power, and we need to bring power of those human beings into making really enforceable international laws. And I can live with the kind of democratic government we have in Canada. It's where, international affairs get involved that I find it impossible. Now I'm going to be quiet again.
Just as a footnote, Meta.
Yeah.
The sad fact is, though, that democracies like Canada, even the United States, which The Economist says it's not a full democracy, incidentally, there's so few of them in the world. And a number of decades ago, actually, there was this democratic peace theory that emerged. And the argument was that if you could expand the number of democracies in the world, one of the huge benefits from that would be that peace would arise, because historically, if you look at democracies, very few democracies have ever engaged in warfare.
No, that's not what it says. It says they do not go to war against each other. And that's correct. Still true.
Yes. Of course, obviously, if authoritarian system in a democracy engaged and one was the aggressor, then democracy would engage into the warfare as a kind of self-defense. You're absolutely right about that. But democracy.
But they didn't even claim who's to blame. They just say democracies and other states go to war. Sure, there's nothing, but it's democracies do not go to war against other democracies. And that's true.
Hence the idea that if you could propagate the world with democratic systems, then peace hopefully would be more common than it is today. And as we know, there's something like 27 conflicts around the world. A number of those conflicts, you have more than 10,000 casualties taking place. And 17 of those, you've got from 1,000 to 10,000 casualties taking place. So is it any wonder people are fleeing those particular conflicts? So the largest source countries for refugees happen to be those countries in which you've had protracted armed conflicts taking place, and those countries don't happen to be democracies.
Okay.
So it's just to reinforce your point, I think, to some extent. There is a qualitative difference, I think, I would agree with you, between non-democratic and democratic systems.
But at the international level, if you're going to have wars and you can't stop a guy like Putin, nobody can go arrest this guy. There's no international police force. I'm not even sure I want one. I think that the Russians themselves should be responsible for bringing him to justice, put him in jail.
I couldn't agree more.
I don't know. What about, I mean, Harry, that's, you know, that's international. That's the rule of law. But why don't we have a rule of law when it comes to international affairs?
Because we have no power.
Hmm?
We have no power. Law eventually rests on somebody be able to make it legitimately enforceable. You speak about democracy. I think a little easily. For instance, the United Nations, which was a major effort to end wars and provide people a sense of responsibility and respect for each other's sovereignty. It was always constructed not to allow that to happen. I mean, it set up a General Assembly of equals, and then it set up a Security Council which could veto anything, where we put the winners, where we put the victors of the last World War. And those people in the Security Council veto anything that doesn't agree with them. And you know, and I don't want to quarrel about this because I think it is very difficult. I have to deal with it. It is true that if you have all these rules in place that we have for treating each other with civil rights of one kind or another, it is nicer to live here than it would be if we didn't have that. At the same time, we have this. We see that we are the nations that don't abide by international rules at all. So, for instance, it is, after all, the United States which refuses to subject itself to the International Court of Criminal Justice because they feel that they're involved in so many wars, they will be called criminals. Mm-hmm. Despite all that, and they will not subject themselves to it. And so, at the more domestic level about democracy, we talk about democracy. It means many things, and for us sitting here in our Zooms, we know that there are many deeper ways to have democracy than just have electoral democracy. You've talked about citizen assemblies, participatory schemes of one kind or another. The one thing we don't have in our system is economic democracy. That is the most obvious thing about our society to me. We have no economic democracy. That's why I talked about the labor relations setting a minute ago. And the corporation, by the way, if as a lawyer, if I would be pardoned, it's almost blasphemous to speak as a lawyer in public, I think, but the corporation is structured not to be democratic. It is essentially non-democratic. It's a hierarchical organization for the accumulation of monies, right, into one big, effective, efficient machine of money making. And its essence is undemocratic, in as much as it votes, it gives shareholders voting power. It is on the basis of $1, one vote. Not one person, one vote, $1, one vote. Mm-hmm. The minority shareholder are the numerous ones in a corporation. And the majority shareholders are, in fact, the individual minority. So that we have within our so-called electoral democracies, abiding by a rule of law, the most important alternative institution, the corporation, is hierarchical and anti-democratic, not just undemocratic.
Okay, now look here. I believe you. I think everybody can see your point. Question is, what kind of solutions can we advocate? What is the best way to get out of this pickle? We've got to get ourselves out of it. So, Harry, what do you want to do about it?
No, I think you should ask Peter. He knows where the power lies.
Okay, Peter? It's up to you. Sell
Um,
this.
well, I write about elites so that people will know who they are and have a sense of the enormous power that if you can control $10 trillion or just a few hundred people are controlling half the wealth in the world in terms of investment policies. And it's highly concentrated. So it's like 0.5% owns well over 50%. And for the most part, 80% of the people in the world live on less than $10 a day. And you know that inequality is, I think, the biggest difficulty in it, and it represses any sort of democratic process because of what Harry says. It's all privatized and controlled by a very few number of people, and it's not meant to be democratic in that sense. It's meant to, and governments recognize their responsibility to keep the economy afloat and continue to allow wealth increase and concentrated wealth. So we're moving in the direction of increasing repression and massive inequality that is threatening the very existence of human beings on this planet.
So what's your solution?
There's right now, William Robinson just wrote a book. He's from UC Santa Barbara, called The Global Civil War. And if you look at the resistance factors in countries all over the world, you see that there's, you know, a huge resistance to continued concentration of global capital. And that inevitably cannot be sustained. That continued concentration will bring about, literally at some point, economic collapse. And with that, millions of people dying from starvation.
Okay, now let's assume
we see
you're
that threat right now.
Peter, you're in charge of the movement to organize these people who are presumably resisting all over the world. I don't know them, but if you say they're there, good. These people resisting and objecting to the concentration of wealth. Now you got to organize them and tell them what to do. What is your game plan? What structures are we going to change that will empower them to make the kind of transformation that you think needs to be made?
I can't have a formula for what we would do. There is no mechanism to make that kind of change that is possible.
Well, you can think of something. We've got to get from here to there. Look, I mean, my view is one of the things you could do is make a law. If we had people, a real democracy in which people make the laws and demand that their legislators make laws that work, then we would have laws to say that every corporation that has more than $100 million assets will have to have a board of directors that is at least half drawn from panels of NGOs representing stakeholders other than the owners of the stock, so that you will have a panel of environmentalists, you have a panel of consumers, you have a panel of people concerned about ethnic equity, you have a panel of people talking about the environmental effects of the production system that the corporation is doing, et cetera. They have to put somebody from each of these panels onto their board of directors and give them the power to make the policies that will constrain the activities of these corporations. And I think that is the first step, if not the only need that needs to be done in order to harness or to discipline these corporations. Tell me why that wouldn't work.
We don't have the power to do that. I mean, we don't.
Then lie down. Just lie down and go to sleep, because you can't do anything.
Not at all.
You might as well not be here, Peter, because you can't do anything. So why should you even bother to even talk? Because you can't do anything. I mean, you don't talk that way. You talk about how you're going to get power, man. I'm going to give you some power. Now use it.
Well, the environmental movement has been quite active for decades and decades. And I think there has been change. There has been change both in the civil society, but also in corporations. Corporations have either been restricted in terms of their means of production that have created all sorts of pollution, or in fact, have been prosecuted and have had to pay out millions of dollars for the pollution that they've created in the past. And maybe the laws in the past didn't require them to do certain things, but as a consequence, people got sick with all sorts of diseases and died, and then were forced to pay out sums of money to compensate those individuals. And now I think even among the young generation, there is great concern about climate change and the impact that's going to have. One of the things that's really troubling to me, and I accept everything that you say, Peter, but fundamentally the system is just dysfunctional. When you have that kind of concentration of wealth, where these individuals presumably are only interested in advancing further accumulation in, I mean, I can't even fathom $1 trillion, but trillions and trillions of dollars that are under control. What's the purpose? And in the nuclear age, where modern warfare can lead to existential risk that eliminates everything, isn't the system itself unhinged to the degree that it's just taking us down a path that's impossible even for itself to exist in its own self-interest? So it seems to me at some point in time, something has to change. And I'm optimistic enough, looking at things like the environmental movement, looking at the women's movement, looking at the labor movement, in terms of the positive changes that have taken place, at least within a small minority of states in the world. And that's not to discount the power of capital and the accumulation that's taking place.
I agree to everything you've said. And I think that it's our job to think up before the crisis occurs, before the whole system collapses, the way that, the communist system did 20, 30 years ago. All of a sudden, they didn't know what to do. And I think the capitalist system may collapse too. But before it happens, we better make some game plans of what we want to have done instead. And maybe even start implementing some of them in a way that will obviate the worst of the effects that are going to occur as a result of all the terrible things that Peter and Harry have been complaining about, which I agree they're true. But we have to do something. We have to figure it out for ourselves right now.
It's that I began with a sense of impotence we all feel. I think we've come to that inevitably whenever you take any look at what's going on. You can't fix the system by just making it work a little better. Which is, I think, what happens when you say to a corporation you can make a little bit less money. I collect stuff, and I think Peter will as well. As we go, we've had for the last number of years now a movement to make the corporations more benign. So we've had we seem to have environmental and social and governance goals as well as money-making goals. The two are always in opposition, and the first lot always suffer. And the evidence is now quite alarmingly large that there is really almost no movement of any change. And all you got to do, and I'm very, very brief, this is the stuff I read all the time. Deviance, as we like to call it, and criminality has not receded one iota since this movement began. There are literally crimes committed by corporations. You were talking before, Metta, about how we should hold Putin to account. I've never seen senior executives and managers and owners of our corporations held to account, let alone war criminals. Mm-hmm. And we haven't even got to that. We don't even think about that. Putting a few more people and NGOs on a corporation will have remarkably little effect, because very soon they'll be told, make money or go. This happened. Anecdotally, I was the chair of a pension plan. neutral chair. I was there as a lawyer of a pension plan, and the employers and the unionists on the plan would all agree that they had to be prudential. What did that mean? It meant investing in the market. And investing in the market, of course, meant to give money to outfits which had ugly aspects. Always, they were always it. You gave it to an aluminium company, which also happened to be making something for tanks, or you gave money to a tobacco company because they were and still are one of the best returning investments.
Okay, I accept your argument. I think we've already agreed that we all agree that we have now is a bad thing.
But if that is true, the enemy is the actual system, right?
Okay, now if the system, let me agree with you that you can't do it incrementally. You have to overthrow the whole system and wholesale bring in something new. Fine, if that's the way you want to think about it, I'll listen to that. Question is, what is it you want to bring in new? We've tried communism. I think you don't want to go there.
No,
we've tried capitalism. I don't think we're happy with that. What else have you got, fella? I don't know. Tell me a new system.
I can't give you a formula either. But
we have to do it now.
But
because the day after the revolution, they give us the keys and they say, okay, you fix it if you think you know better. I don't know how. So let's think about it ahead of time.
One of the interesting things, I think, I'm just going to throw this out there. I'm not disagreeing with Harry or Peter, but hasn't it been shown that ethical investment is more profitable in the long run than the kind of criminality, the kind of, short-term investment, make the dollar right away? There have been many examples of investments that have been ethically and morally sound that have proven to be far more profitable than the shortcuts, the criminality, the short-term profiteering. And just to pick up on a point that Harry's made, there have been many financiers that have been prosecuted and incarcerated for bilking people on criminal matters, not necessarily the large corporations per se, but individuals that have duped the investors in terms of short-term profits, where you could turn around huge investments, the Ponzi schemes and everything else that people are propagating. But corporations have done this as well. They've made bad investments with stockholders' monies, and they've lost everything, and they've gone bankrupt. So there are examples, on the contrary, in which people have failed and lost everything. And on the other side, there have been very ethical, moral investments that have proved to be much more profitable and much more sound than the kind of traditional investments that you gave an example of in terms of that, Harry. So I think we have to balance it out to some degree.
I interrupted Harry, so maybe I should apologize and let you finish what you were trying to say.
No apologies needed. I'm happy to be interrupted, actually. I'll just take up James' point for a second. I won't quarrel about numbers. Ethical investment has a limit. And its limit is always that initially when an ethical investment group goes in, they do an enormous amount of research, more research than all other people who are investing, because they have to be clean when they finish. So they have an incentive to, and they do that, and they do very well initially, and then they stop growing. Then they stop doing very well. Some have an influence on people, but very, very little of the investment is in fact ethical in that pure sense. It's nearly always mixed. They always accept different things. Some people have pure alcohol investment, other people war-making machinery, other environmental, but not all of them do all at once. And so the efforts are sort of haphazard and not always all that successful. But more importantly, to the point you're making, you're right that some financiers and people are sent to jail. but nearly always when they cheat other capitalists. Key to that is the key to that is that they mustn't and not when they cheat me, so, or they cruel my environment, or they kill workers at work, right? None of that. And I think there is a very big difference. We do treat property owners in a very different way in our system, democratic as we are. And then I'll make my very last point. I think we've been very glib about calling ourselves democratic and other people authoritarian. I don't think that's I don't think that the dichotomy is anywhere near as clear as our discussion has suggested it has been. It is. I, for instance, wish that we called the Chinese authoritarian for the way they handle COVID, and we presumably are democratic, but we're killing way more people than they are. Mm-hmm. I don't know how I make that judgment. And I also notice that we say democracies don't fight democracies. As far as I know, for instance, China, which is one of our bêtes noires at the moment, China hasn't been at war for 50 years. And whereas, for instance, we, US, Canada, have been incessantly at war.
That's a point. That's a good point. And I think probably the fairest solution is for Peter Phillips to have the last word.
Yes.
When we talk about global inequality, there's very little that we can do other than encourage nonviolent non-cooperation. And we can just start challenging, as BlackRock has been challenged on their investment policies for global warming and oil companies. And they had activists that were camped out in front of Larry Fink's home. And they told him, and he finally said, okay, we're going to make a change. It's all very minor, but that's, having tactical, nonviolent, non-cooperation. I certainly wouldn't advocate for violence, but human beings can choose not to participate in targeted economies that is hurting them.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a good start. It's not going to overthrow the system. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what goes beyond that, but I'm all in favor of that. Everybody now, we will gather outside my apartment and plan what corporation we're going to do a sit-in. And okay, thank you all. This has been bracing. I don't know whether it's fun, but it's certainly important. Thank you all. Have a great day. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you very much, Meta.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Nice
to meet you.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, and sometimes more. This is episode number 483. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we post the transcripts there. And when you get there, look around. We have all kinds of conversations going on there. And to find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, share your thoughts about the show with the viewers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.